Hello to everyone joining in this evening. We'll get started in just a couple minutes here. Thanks for spending your evening with us. And tonight we're going to be learning about how to create a beautiful shade garden with Melinda Myers. So just sit tight and we'll get started in a couple minutes here. Hello to everyone joining in. Thank you for sharing your evening with us. We'll get started in just a moment with Melinda Myers and how to create a beautiful shade garden. Go ahead and get started for real this time. So hello again, everyone. My name is Kelly Bolter. I am the Adult Programming Coordinator at Milwaukee Public Library. Welcome to everyone. Thanks for spending your evening with us. Tonight, we're going to learn from Melinda Myers about how to create a beautiful shade garden. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. On the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A box that you can press there and type in your questions for Melinda. We'll have a little bit of time after the main presentation for Melinda to answer your questions. And you can feel free to use the chat box also on the bottom of your screen to talk with each other. And also please feel free to share where you're tuning in from. It's great to see where everyone's from. So without further ado, I'm very happy to hand it over to Melinda.
Thanks, Kelly. You should have received a link to the handout, and I know Kelly's putting that in the chat as well. And I just wanted to mention, if you look at that long list of plants, you might think you're going to be here till midnight. I'm not keeping you till midnight. So what I want to do is I wanted to show you there are so many choices for shade gardens, and there's a lot of detail on your handout. So I'm going to talk about the key points for each plant that maybe the reason why you might want to include it. But before we get started, I want to thank Diggers Hotline. They're sponsoring the webinar, so we can offer this for free. I want to thank Kelly and her team at the Milwaukee Public Library for hosting the event, and they will house this recording on their YouTube channel, and there'll be a link from my website as well. So thanks to them for hosting. So the first thing I want you to do when you think about shade is evaluate how much shade you really have, matching those plants to the amount of shade. When I lived in the city, I had one of those typical urban houses where houses were 8 feet apart. And even though it was the south side of my house, my neighbor's two-story brick house and my two-story brick house provided a lot of shade. But what I didn't realize till I started planting is I had some pretty good light coming in the morning and the afternoon and was able to grow some plants that really needed a little more sunlight. So check on that area and decide, is it partial shade? Do you have 3 to 6 hours of direct sunlight? Now, if it's afternoon sun, guess what? That's pretty intense, and a lot of full sun plants will thrive in part sun if it's from the west. East exposure is perfect for those part shade to shade plants. It's less intense. So check that out if it's partial shade on that tag. Full shade is less than 3 hours of direct sunlight. So you're going to check throughout the day and throughout the season to see exactly how much. I found this cool link to how to use your iPhone to register the amount of sunlight that an area in your garden receives. And there's a link on your handout to that. And then dense shade, there's no direct or dappled light. So that's pretty dark. So you may not be growing these plants, but we'll talk about some alternatives for those as well. I mentioned checking throughout the day, but also seasonally. You know that as your garden comes alive and the trees start to leaf out, it changes the amount of light beneath. So some of those spring ephemerals, tulips like you see here that need good bright sunlight, get what they need before the trees leaf out and that shade really moves into the landscape. Now, light is one limiting factor, but I often find that it's really about the water that's limiting the issue. Think about after a heavy rainstorm, go out under the dense shade of a maple tree, an oak tree, and that soil's pretty dry. And what does get through to the soil is often absorbed by the roots of the tree. So the first few years are critical when we're trying to establish plants in shade where there's a lot of competition from the canopy above or under an overhang where no sun, no water gets through. I just wanted to point out, I'm not going to talk about the yellow flowered plant in the front, but you might be interested. It's a corydalis, and it blooms all season long, but it reseeds readily. You can kind of see it's found its way through the garden. I love this plant, easy to pull, but it is a little vigorous, but one to check out. If you decide to increase the light, some people will do some pruning, trying to increase the amount of light reaching the garden below. Work with a certified arborist. Go to Trees Are Good, and you can find a certified arborist in your area. They have the right equipment and training to do the job right. You don't want to wreck the tree to grow plants beneath it. There are lots of shade tolerant annuals, but I decided those are pretty easy, right? Impatiens, coleus that are shade tolerant, begonias. We're pretty familiar, easier to find than some of the shade tolerant perennials. And I just want to mention maybe popping them in for sporadic color versus mass plantings is another way to add some needed color without overwhelming it with a bed of impatiens. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but you might want to do more perennials, just a few annuals, and then look for something different. On the left of your screen is wishbone plant or Torrenia, shade tolerant, a little more heat tolerant than pansies. Kind of reminds me a little bit. If you look closely, the stamen, the male parts kind of bend together looking like a wishbone. On the right is Browalia. I'm seeing some really nice new varieties come out in whites and blue. So just something different for that shady spot in your landscape. So let's start with perennials. One of the benefits if you're working under trees is you only have to plant once, right? Hostas are always the first thing we think about. And I don't want to poo-poo hostas, but I'm not going to spend much time on them because I think we're all used to using them. But if you ever get to the Twin Cities, go west of the Twin Cities to Chanhassen to the University of Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. They have a hosta glade. I haven't been there or Glen, for a couple of years, but these hostas, this collection of hostas growing under the sugar maples. When I first read about it, I was like, oh, how interesting could that be? It was beautiful, the different colors, the different size foliage. So if you get in that area, check out that arboretum. It's really got some great gardens to see. When we're looking at shade gardens, we're looking at green as a color, but there are different shades of green, but there's different textures of plants as well. In the foreground, that silver and green plant we'll talk about later, Siberian bugloss has rounded leaves. We've got the big leaves of hostas, the fine leaves of the hawcone grass. And look at how those textures play together and add interest into the garden. And here's on a larger scale, moving from a more sunny spot into the shade in this front landscape. Hostas, and we've got some ginger, we've got some violets, we've got the hawcone grass, we've got a few shade tolerant lilies as well. And just want you to kind of look at how, especially grasses, how texture can take your eye through. So on the right, we have a lot of hostas, and your eye is grabbed by those hosta leaves helping to guide you through that garden, take you from the front to the back. Grasses, sedges, and the hawcone grass can do the same to unify a planting to provide relief from those bold leaves of the hosta. Now, I had a city lot with a big street tree like my friend Ed here. This is his front garden. And so I had a lot of shade. Now I'm out in the country with sunlight and I'm kind of missing my shade. So I have a few spots in mind. But look for those opportunities. Before you plant the tree border, that space between the sidewalk and the street, make sure you find out what the rules and regulations are. You don't want to obstruct visibility for traffic and people. A lot of cities will say, you could plant there, but if we have to come and do any work on utilities or street tree or the sidewalk, we'll replace it with grass, not the plants you want. I had a tree border, a big garden, couple gardens in my tree border, and I worked with the city when they came to fix the sidewalks to remove the plants that would be impacted so that I didn't lose that investment. So we're going to take you sort of through the season of perennials with in and timing of bloom. Skunk cabbage is one you may have a hard time finding, but I wanted to talk about it. It's native, endangered in some places. The flowers smell, that helps attract flies to pollinate, but it tolerates wet soil, boggy conditions, damp conditions like you see here. But I wanted to mention, look how big the leaves get. They look like hostas on steroids, and the deer tend to leave them be. Intermixed are marsh marigolds, much easier to find, shade tolerant, moist to wet soil tolerant as well. The leaves persist all season long, and those bright yellow flowers in the spring, boy, they just grab your attention. And just a picture of how they look as those flowers are beginning to fade. Nice for those damp areas. Spring ephemerals, I'm not going to talk a lot about them. You see the trilliums here, but again, spring ephemerals come up early before the trees leaf out. They bloom, they get the energy they need, and usually go dormant in the summer. A walk through the woods will really show you how those grow. So those are options for those denser, shady areas. I like bloodroot. I grew it at my old house. And that bright white flowers, I mixed this with some Japanese painted fern. And boy, they just shone in the shade of that area. The leaves tend to die back mid to late summer, and the plants go dormant. At that time, we'll take dry shade. But early in the season, these are low growing. Again, your handout's going to have sizes, soil conditions, and a little more detail on the pollinators they provide. One of the benefits of spring ephemerals and early bloomers is they provide pollen and nectar for early season pollinators, something that's lacking in some parts of the country, especially if you're from the north. So again, just a great pollinator plant early in the season. Hellebores. I remember when I first started trying to plant hellebores, it took me a couple tries to find the best spot for them in my city garden. I don't know if I've just gotten better or my soil conditions are better, but it seems like I'm having much better luck, and maybe it's the newer varieties. You will find doubles like you see here: cream, green, yellow, pinks, purple, reds. I've seen these covered with snow, a foot of snow for like a week. The snow melted and you could still see the flowers. They looked perfect. The species tend to have downward facing flowers. So you want to keep that in mind. I don't find that a problem. Some people prefer that the flowers face out. So a lot of breeders are working on outward facing flowers as well as doubles. But lots of variety. Early bloomers, those are the sepals that are really colorful, and those persist often throughout the growing season. They're evergreen in milder climates. They do kind of get ratty towards the end of winter, so you may want to prune out that old dry foliage to let the flowers really shine. Supposed to be deer resistant, though I've had a few people tell me the deer did munch on them. If you've heard me speak, you know this is one of my favorite ground covers, barrenwort. And the reason being it takes dry shade. And that's important because we often use these under trees. When the leaves emerge, you can see a bit of that red tinge left on the leaf, and they emerge with the flowers blooming at the same time. The leaves turn green in summer, they turn red in fall, and then for some areas, they're evergreen. In the north, they tend to have a few leaves that do kind of hang on. But we're seeing lots of new cultivars introduced with variations on the flower, whites and yellows, reds and purples. And just, it's slow to get started, but once it gets started, it can really fill in an area like you see here. Virginia or pig squeak. If you rub the leaves, they squeak like a pig. You love or hate this plant. They supposedly deer resistant, though the deer have been munching on mine. Big leaves, kind of reminiscent maybe of a cabbage plant. And couple reasons I like it. Early blooms in the spring, white or pink, so they're up early. You can see removing the dried up foliage is a good idea, though there's still some remaining. After the the flowers die back, the leaves remain, and then you get this beautiful red, purpley red fall color in the fall that will persist through the winter. I even have it evergreen or ever purple in my neck of the woods, and I love mixing it with the bulbs that come up with that red backdrop. It's just beautiful. Lungwort. Dawn, who works with me, says she always watches this for the hummingbird's arrival in her landscape. One of the nice things about lungwort, you may use this as a hosta substitute if you're tired of fighting the deer. It has hairy leaves and they can be solid green, small or large, or variegated. If powdery mildew's been a problem on lungwort, a friend of mine said that she likes to use the variegated ones because then you can't tell it's got mildew and just tells everyone they're variegated. The flowers can be purple fading to pink. They can be red, like you see here with red raspberry splash, and there are also white ones. So very ornamental. The foliage persists all summer long. They're probably about 12 or 15 inches tall. Beautiful flowers, early bloomers to brighten up the spring. Columbine. This is our native columbine, a hummingbird favorite. But you want the ones with the spurs because that's where the nectar is, and that's what the hummingbirds are after. It does reseed readily, so a couple of columbine plants will quickly take over a garden. So you may want to remove the flowers as they fade after the hummingbirds and other pollinators are done with them to remove the seeds, or let them seed and kind of keep the plants you want, move the others to other locations. On the right, you see the flowers of the native one are downward facing. Again, that's bothersome to some people. So the breeders, as you see on the left, have been working on or have developed some that face outward and different colors. Now, one thing I found with the hybrids is removing the flowers as they fade. It seems to help them live longer. When we let them set seed, they often decline after a few years. Nora Barlow on the left is a double flowered one that doesn't even look like a columbine. And then you'll see there's lots of new varieties being introduced with variations on the flower size. I mentioned Siberian bugloss Brunnera before. One reason I like this is look at those blue forget-me-not-like flowers. Now, some of the forget-me-nots, like woodland forget-me-not, is invasive. So this gives you the beauty of the forget-me-not without the problem. Now, Brunnera will reseed. The seedlings may be green or they may be variegated. They're not I always check, but it never hurts for you to double check that I haven't seen these as invasive. And I just find they reseed a bit in the garden. So I pull the ones that are green I don't want. I keep the ones I do. I can move them around as needed. Once the flowers fade, you have this variegated foliage that brightens up the shade. Just a close up of the blooms. This is, I think this is Looking Glass on the right. Look at how it's really kind of almost kind of got a coating of, like a clear kind of a translucent white. So here are just a couple of popular varieties. Jack Diamond on the left with pretty good sized leaves. In the middle, Variegata, a very different look than say Jack Frost that I showed you earlier. And on the right is Emerald Mist. This is a newer one, but look at that deep green that really gives you a good contrast with the silver. So you'll find new varieties being introduced. A nice, maybe 12, 15-inch tall plant that gives you nice bright color throughout the season with the leaves. Use it in a container. It works great when it's blended with annuals or with perennials in a pot. Variegated Solomon seal. A couple reasons I like this, and you might want to consider. It's very architectural, very upright. Think about the other plants. They tend to be rounded and mounded. This is very upright. The variegation is very subtle, so I find it easy to mix with other plants. Sometimes when we get too much variegation going, it's a little overwhelming. So you can find them combined here with hosta and the Brunnera. I think that's a double stuff on the left. I haven't been able to find plants. This was at Chicago Botanic Garden. White flowers in the spring that dangle from the stem, blue fruit, do not eat them, they're poisonous, and yellow fall color. So you get multiple seasons. They will grow and form a nice colony, sometimes a little slow to start if it's under a tree. Bleeding hearts. This is one of those plants you grow because your grandma grew it, your uncle grew it, somebody in your life grew it. There's all kinds of stories about breaking the flowers apart and finding the ship and the pirate and the princess slipper. When I share those, the kids roll their eyes at me. The parents are usually intrigued. This is a big plant. It does die back midsummer, so you want to design your garden with that in mind. Or when it's done blooming, cut it back halfway. That often encourages new growth, and so you don't have that bare spot in the garden midsummer. But if you like the looks of bleeding heart, but you want something smaller and something that's going to hold the leaves, consider fringe bleeding heart. Native to the Appalachian Mountain area, the flowers are a little bit different shape, but you still see the heart. The foliage is very ferny. It does well, it blooms after common bleeding heart and then sporadically throughout the summer. Put it in part shade. Hot afternoon sun will scorch the leaves. This is probably luxuriant or king of hearts. Look at that blue-green leaves. Just a nice backdrop for those pink flowers. Again, lots of pollinator appeal. I'm not mentioning a lot of that because it's in your handout. And almost everything we talk about appeals to some type of pollinator, bee, butterfly, hummingbirds, or the seeds feed the songbirds. Canadian ginger, our native ginger, it's deciduous. It dies back in the winter, unlike evergreen European ginger. Couple reasons I like this. A friend of mine, I was visiting her house and she goes, "Do you know what grows under a spruce tree?" I said, "What?" She reaches the lowest branch laying on the ground, lifts it up, and says, "Canadian ginger." I have used this in places under a dense canopy of maples where the homeowner couldn't get anything else growing. Does need some extra moisture to get it started. It will tolerate that dry shade. It won't expand as quickly. But if it's happy, it can be rather assertive to aggressive in the garden. Nice leaves throughout the growing season. The flowers, you got to peek under the leaves, pollinated by beetles and maybe even slugs. And the common name comes from the fact colonists were using this as a substitute for ginger. Goat's beard. And this picture really does its justice for the size. When I first planted my first goat's beard I grew was at my city lot and I didn't pay attention to the tag. And I was like, wow, this thing is huge. And I had to move it and actually divided it and gave a chunk to my neighbor. It's a big plant, blooms early in the season. There are male and female flowers, male and female plants, flowers separately. The male flowers tend to be a little showier. It does do best with a little bit of shade, though I've grown it in full sun, but make sure it gets the moist soil. A friend of mine, I was visiting his garden and he had this plant, and I thought it was an apricot flower to still be, but the leaves looked more like a goat's beard. And so when I went and took a closer look, he had painted the seed heads. So that's a way of extending it. But I thought this gardener, by leaving them stand and leaving the seed heads on there, they kind of mimic that chartreuse and the hosta, and I thought added some interesting texture to the garden. And there are smaller varieties as well. Golden Alexander. This native plant takes full sun to full shade, moist, wet soil conditions. It blooms early in the season, and yellow flowers can really brighten up the shade. It's a little more casual in its appearance, so it does great in semi-formal or natural plantings as well. Coral bells. If you haven't found one you like, you haven't looked hard enough. Coral bells. We first started growing them. The flowers were coral colored, bell shaped. Hummingbirds and pollinators love them. And then breeders got involved, breeding them for better foliage color, crossing them with foam flower tiarella for interesting shaped leaves. And sometimes we lost the flowers or they were less showy. I think now we're seeing plants that have great foliage and great flowers. And so, wide variety to choose from. Some prefer a little more sun than others. Some do have to have the shade. I'm growing blackberry ice. I love that purpley red color. Looks beautiful. Glazed and infused, you could see what a great name. Look at that foliage, and those flowers are beautiful, nice contrasting. These make a low mound. Some spread by rhizomes, some are more clumpers. They are subject to frost heaving. So with the crazy weather, a lot of us have experienced warm, cold, warm, cold. Go check and make sure that they're still in the ground. If not, tap them back in place so the roots are insulated. Southern Comfort is one of the villosa types. It has a hairy leaf, and the villosa types tend to be more heat and humidity tolerant. So if you're having problems with them melting out in the summer, check out the villosa types. Just a couple of samples of adding a great edging plant like you see here, and I love how they contrast that mounded growth habit with the vertical accent of the leaves. This was a picture in my garden in the winter. Some winters when it's mild or we have good snow cover, my coral bells holds its foliage all winter long. So as the snow melts, I have some beautiful leaves to look at. Yeah, they're a little ratty, but I am in the north. And then maybe in a container as well, just like the Brunnera, maybe potting them up in a pot, then you could move them into the garden in the fall or move that container, depending on where you live, in an unheated garage if your winters are cold. Astilbe. This is for those of you that are good about keeping plants watered. Too much sun, not enough water, you can watch them just turn brown and die. They really do best with part to even some fairly full shade, but moist soils is a key. Anywhere from 12 inches to 4 feet tall. Whites and reds and purple flowers. The leaves look good all season long. And depending on the variety, it may be an early or a mid or a late summer bloomer. This was dark side of the moon. So when it's done flowering, those leaves are still going to look great in the garden. I'm not sure of the variety on the left, but just to give you an idea. And on the right is Color Splash. These were introduced a few years ago. I haven't found them as vigorous, but boy, that little splash of color in the garden is really a plus. On the left is Astilbe chinensis pumila, the Chinese Astilbe. I find this one tolerates full sun and drier conditions much better than most. It spreads by rhizome, so you can see it really filled in this area nicely. But I find that it's much more tolerant. So if you tend to be an underwater or really like Astilbe and want to push it into sunlight, that would be a good one to try. On the right, here it is with Japanese painted fern. And so you can see the difference in the texture and the size and the shape of the plant. I hope some of you have tried Rogers flower. If not, add this to your list. This is from my friend Dorothy's garden, and I have some in a bed by my house, and I had them in my old home too. Look at those leaves. If you know horse chestnut or buckeye trees, those leaves look just like those, so big and bold and nothing like it in the shade garden. White or pink flowers, and they usually bloom for me around the middle to the third week in June. So depending on where you live, a little earlier or a little later. Moist soil is critical for these. If it gets too dry, they're going to scorch out and really suffer. The leaves emerge this nice bronze, and there are some that are even more noticeable, like bronze peacock, that hold a little bit of that bronzy color in the leaves as well. Here you can see they're emerging with the Mertensia or Virginia bluebells. Ligularia. This is a plant that likes it wet, and it's got great foliage. You can find green leaves, or you could get some like Marie Britt that have purple foliage, big daisy-like flowers, bright yellow, really pretty. This was taken in Michigan. This was the end of August. So Ligularia likes it moist, tolerates wet, will take shade. In the sun, you better make sure it gets plenty of moisture. And nice foliage, nice flowers as well. Othella has orange blooms. Look how pretty that orange is against the leaves. The rocket, spiky, those daisy flowers are on a spike, and so gives you a vertical accent, a little bit bigger and more dentate leaves. And on the right, you'll see the Chinese dragon, very dissected foliage and very interesting, a little more narrower curved petals on the flowers as well. So when the blooms are done or before they come out, you've got these nice leaves. Our native swamp mallow, there are cultivars like you see on the left, is a shrub-sized plant, but it dies back. It's late to emerge in the spring, so mark its location with spring flowering bulbs or with tags, or I always leave a few inches above the ground. And even though I know it emerges late, I'm always like, oh boy, is it going to make it? Is it going to make it? And I'm always rewarded. It takes off. It's big. The hummingbirds love this plant as well as other pollinators. And those flowers are the size of a dinner plate. So it's a really nice addition. Those were mine in more sunny, drier conditions. This is back at my friend Ed's city garden in Iowa, and you could see how much bigger they are. He's much better at watering, nice shade on those plants. And so a bigger looking plant, but the same big, beautiful blooms. Sun King Golden Japanese Spikenard, what a name. Aurelia cordata, I think is easier to say and remember. It's grown for the leaves. You can sort of see those white flowers peeking up at the top of the screen. They will bloom usually, but not reliably, in little black berries. But it's all about the leaves. Now, this is pretty heavy shade. So they start out kind of yellow, then they go to this bright chartreuse or lime, I guess more lime green, a brighter green next to the hakone grass. Here it is in sun. So you can see the difference, giving it a little more sunlight, how much yellower that foliage is. So it's a big plant, depending on where you live and how much moisture and how much light it receives, 3 to 5 feet or more tall and wide. So give it room. It looks like a shrub when it's full size during the summer. Bugbane. Used to be Cimicifuga, now it's Actea. This is a fall blooming with purple foliage. Notice the yellow hakone grass in front of it. When we put purple leafed plants in the shade, they often disappear. Putting something contrasting like some yellow or silver helps them jump out and so you don't lose them in the shade. So bugbane, fragrant flowers, great for pollinators. There's the summer blooming, racemosa, on your handout, and the fall blooming, ramosa or simplex. And the summer blooming ones tend to be the foliage is like 3.5 feet tall, but the blooms can be 5 or 6 feet high. Walk through these at our Berner Botanical Gardens in the Rock Garden. The path is lined with these, and you go in the evening and you could smell the fragrance, and the flowers just jump out in that shady kind of dusk time frame. And they often call these fairy candles because they look like they're floating carried by a fairy. So one of the nice things about that, it's a tall plant. There aren't a lot of tall shade plants. Cardinal flower, you love it. Now, I talked to some gardeners a couple weeks ago that one person said, I got seedlings everywhere, but most gardeners I talked to have trouble keeping it alive. So if you haven't been successful, you're in the majority. If you have more than you can handle, pat yourself on the back. Vertical accent, full sun to part shade. I've seen in fairly heavy shade, moist to wet soil. And it's short-lived, meaning the plant may only live a few years, but if it is reseeding, you'll continue to have plants. But this is the reason so many people like it. Tall, vertical accent, that bright red brightens up the garden, and the hummingbirds love this plant. As the season's winding down, Joe Pye weed, late summer into fall, big, beautiful, bodacious plant, they used to call this. Pollinators love this. The one on the right is I think both of these are from the Botanic Garden, Berner Botanical Gardens in the Milwaukee metro area. And I love sitting on that patio watching all the swallowtail butterflies come and nectar on the plants. So it's a nice big one. Full sun to part shade, moist soil will even tolerate some flooding. A great rain garden plant. Another late season bloomer is turtlehead, Chelone. This is probably hot lips, which is a shorter variety with hot pink flowers. Take a look at the flowers. This is our native white turtlehead that grows about 3 feet tall or more. And it's great for pollinators, but if you look closely, it kind of may remind you of a turtle's head. Great for rain gardens because it takes moist to wet soil conditions and it will tolerate shade, and it's a late season bloomer. Now, when you think of goldenrod, you may think full sun, but you may also think about aggressive plants taking over the garden. The two I'm going to talk about are more refined, so easier to grow on a urban or suburban lot, and they tolerate shade. Blue stem tolerates part shade. Notice the bee. Benefit of goldenrod is a lot of the late season pollinators depend on the flowers for nectar and pollen, and the birds enjoy the seeds. So blue stem, part shade, about 2 to 4 feet tall. Anise scented, crush the leaves. They smell like licorice. Will even take more shade, even denser shade. And this one's a little bit bigger. And again, just like the blue stem, it's a little more contained, great for pollinators, and the seeds feed the birds. The other plant that we think about in fall, and one we also think is for full sun, is are the asters. This is heart-leafed aster. And you may notice asters are renamed, and there's like 5 different genera in that group we call aster. But the heart-leafed aster will take some part shade. It's a relatively small to medium-sized perennial, long blooming. So pollinators appreciate it, but the birds will eat the seeds. So leave those dried seed heads on for the winter, and you might get some seedlings. Woodland aster, another shade tolerant, even more so than the heartleaf aster. A little bit bigger, can get up to 3 or 4 feet tall. If you have problems with them flopping, especially in the shade, put some partners nearby that are a little stiffer and sturdier, or cutting it back early in the season will help keep it compact, will delay bloom a bit. Ostrich fern, I'm kind of watching my clock because I want to make sure I get through at least mentioning. When I think of ostrich fern, I think of all the gardeners who bring dried up, scorched fronds of this plant to me in August. It needs moist soil. It does better with shade or morning sun. If your hostas scorch out in the area, your ostrich fern probably will too. But this native plant has nice soft texture. Look how beautiful it is with the bolder leaves of the hosta and the more architectural leaves of the Solomon seal. Dre's dagger fern is a cultivar of lady's fern. Lady's fern is another native, a couple feet tall. Now, one thing, our ferns don't have flowers. They propagate by spores, but they do provide habitat and shelter for frogs and toads and many pollinators. So they are good for the wildlife in our gardens, as well as the beauty and the texture they provide. Lots of new introductions. If you're in the southeast Wisconsin area, Rotary Gardens in Janesville has a certified fern garden and collection. So it's a great place to go and see lots of different ferns. I've had good luck with Japanese painted fern in my city lot. I again have so much sun. I haven't added them. I just added a few to my gardens here, but they are an easy to grow, low growing, form a rosette. Sometimes you'll get a sprout of green. Get rid of that unless you want the whole plant to become green because it's more vigorous than the variegated. That's just a sport, a mutation. Get rid of it. You may want to, I enjoyed mine for one season and then took it out the next year. This is crested form, the crested surf. If you look at the tips of the fronds, the pinnae, they're crested. Ghost on the left, kind of that ghostly gray green, and nice texture combination with the plants around it. And on the right, here it is with hawkcone or Japanese forest grass, which is the next plant on the list. This is the one ornamental grass that thrives in the shade. At Berner Botanical Garden, they lost some trees to a straight line wind and they left the hawkcone or Japanese forest grass in place, and it actually did okay. This plant needs good moisture to get established. I had to move mine around by my faucet. So where I filled my container, my watering can for my containers, I'd remember to water this as needed. It didn't die of neglect, but it just didn't take off. So watch the moisture the first few years. This is a great way to get that grass-like texture, that mounded appearance. Reminds me of a spider plant if you're a house plant gardener. There's varieties available, so take a look at them. When they bloom, I think the flowers have a bit of a pink tinge, and the fall color also has a little pink tinge as well. This is a Walnut Rotary garden, and even in the winter, when those leaves are brown, it adds some interesting texture. When I went to watch the Christmas lights at the Rotary Gardens, I walked by this and was really impressed with the winter display. Pennsylvania sedges, and I have a link to Sensational Sedges, a handout that Mark Dwyer provided for a webinar he did. Oh, he's a great plantsman and a good speaker. So if you ever see he's on a program or a webinar, take advantage of his expertise. But he did a whole thing on various sedges, their sizes. Do they take sun? Do they take shade? Do they tolerate dry soil? Do they tolerate moist soil? This is Pennsylvania sedge, often used as a ground cover. It's our native sedge that you'll see growing in woodlands with little tufts. Supposedly will take a fair amount of sun as well, but a nice way to cover the ground. One of the cool things that I just was learning more about this year is a lot of people are using sedges as a living mulch. So instead of mulching the garden with leaves or evergreen needles, they're planting sedges or other plants in between their main plant to cover the soil, conserve that moisture, but things that aren't going to outcompete. And sedges really add nice texture, as you can see with the oak leaf hydrangea. There are decorative sedges as well. Mary Meyer from the University of Minnesota has done research on cold hardy grasses and sedges. She's also looking for invasiveness. So any of you that are in the Midwest or the North, check that out. She's got great information that can help you when you're selecting these and grasses. I love the palm sedge. And if you could look at the leaves, it's a stem and the leaves come out perpendicular to the stem. This is ohm with a little bit of variegation. It is aggressive. So be prepared. We put this in our rain garden, which this is a picture of at State Fair Park. This must have been the first year or one we dug, divided, and replanted. It grows about 20 inches tall. It kind of glistens in the sun. It tolerates shade. It spreads aggressively. We were dividing this up. We sent home trunks full of this sedge with all the volunteers. I brought a chunk home, set it on the ground, and never got around to planting it till the fall. It was still alive. I divided it, put it by the barn where it got some water, but probably would have appreciated more. And it's still doing okay. Not taken over because it hasn't gotten the TLC it wants, but it's still doing well. And next year, and this coming year is my year to give it the TLC it needs. And then there's broader leafed ones like you see here. So all kinds of textures available, and use it to soften hardscapes in your landscape as well. Don't kill the trees for the flowers. So when we go, I hate to see people break out the tiller, go over back and forth digging up the soil. The majority of the feeder roots are in the top 12 to 18 inches. Don't pile soil over the roots. As little as an inch can kill some species. Instead, pop in those plants between the major roots. If you need to, top dress with a little compost. Mulch the soil. Let the plants fill in on their own. If you do want flowers, dig a hole, bury a couple of nursery pots, the things shrubs come in the ground. Then pot up your annuals for a pop of color, and then set that pot in the pot you buried. You're disturbing the roots once and easier on your back. Mulch may be the answer. You may have to just give it up and just mulch under that tree. Put a great hiding spot for kids or a nice place to hide out and read a book. So sometimes it's just too shady. And if you're struggling with moss, know that some people pay money for moss. Moss occurs where there's poor drainage, compacted soil, typically acidic soil, but there are some that also thrive in more alkaline or high pH soils and some that take it dry. And so instead of trying to get rid of it, maybe you make a moss garden instead. A few vines. Dutchman's pipe. Those are the flowers of the Dutchman pipe. They look like little pipes. You may have seen pipe vines that have huge flowers. Those are more tropical. A very vigorous vine, as you see on the left. But boy, this is mine on the right. And it's always so exciting when I go out and I start watching for the flowers. For me, it's late May, early June. And often you have to peek under the leaves. But boy, how fun to spot these unique flowers. And then this year, and every couple of years, I'll find holes in the leaves, and it's from the pipevine swallowtail. For me, the adults sometimes blow in with the wind, lay their eggs on the pipevine. The egg hatches. This is the result. They eat the leaves. There's so many you don't notice. Great for screening this plant and fun to watch the wildlife, the caterpillars and butterflies that visit. Our native coral honeysuckle vine, this is not the invasive Japanese honeysuckle vine. It's our native. Full sun to part shade. I've seen it in fairly heavy shade, though it is subject to mildew. So the more shade, the more likely you have mildew. And they also get aphids. The flowers on the left are a cultivar of our native. It's Major Wheeler. I find less problems with powdery mildew. I only get a few aphids. And the good news is the hummingbirds, as they're nectaring on the flower, will munch on the aphids and keep them under control for me. So a vigorous twining vine, give it support. It quickly will fill in a couple of years. You may need to do some pruning to reinvigorate, but it'll recover quickly. Just a close up of the flowers. Virgin's bower, the last of the vines I'm going to talk about, spreads by seeds and rhizomes, so you need to give it some room. It will tolerate shade. Blooms late in the season, fragrant flowers, and so it's a native plant. But give it space because you're going to want to enjoy the beauty or be prepared to kind of contain its spread. But a nice way to end the growing season with a little bit of fragrance and color. May remind you of sweet autumn clematis, which unfortunately we're finding is invasive in parts of the country. I know I'm trying to get through these fast, so hang on. We're going to plow through the shrubs and just mention a few trees. So a couple things. We're going to start kind of in order of bloom. So we're starting the season with vernal witch hazel, hardy to zone 4, but sometimes a late spring frost takes out the flowers, which can be yellow, orange, or red. But look at that red fall color. So if you get the bloom, if you're in the north, you may not have blooms every year depending on the spring, but boy, you'll have a nice shrub for the summer and great fall color. Azaleas and rhododendrons all are in the genus rhododendron. Azaleas tend to be deciduous, tend to have more funnel form or tubular flowers, while the rhododendrons tend to be evergreen and they tend to have more bell-shaped flowers. Being a northern gardener, our rhododendrons tend to lose their leaves, so they're semi-evergreen. They do benefit from a sheltered location, sheltered from winter wind and winter sun. If you see wilted on the rhododendron evergreen leaves, it could be cold damage. So wonderful for our early pollinators, for those hummingbirds if they move into your area when those rhododendrons and azaleas are blooming. PJM is probably the hardiest rhododendron. I mentioned the Northern Lights in the last slide. If you're down south, you can grow Encore, which is a repeat blooming azalea. So you get these beautiful flowers more than once. Fothergilla, there's the dwarf and the larger size. The flowers appear early with the leaves just as they're emerging. Fragrant, great for hummingbirds. Nice foliage all season. Some have a blue-green leaves and the fall color is incredible. The more shade, the less intense the fall color. Rabbits do like this, so keep an eye on it because you may need to do a little plant skid repellent. Saskatoon, Amelanchiers, they like moist, well-drained soil. Flowers in the spring, white flowers, fruit you and the birds can enjoy. This one has larger fruit, often grown for the fruit. It's edible if you can beat the birds to it, and great fall color. Running, and there's the fruit. Starts out pink, turns blue like a blueberry. Here's a close-up of some Amelanchier flowers. This is running serviceberry. It spreads by rhizomes, tends to be more dry soil tolerant, but the same features, fall, spring blooms, fruit you and the birds can enjoy, and fall color. Often yellow, but you may get some nice oranges as well. Chokeberry, take a bite of the fruit and you're sure to know why it got that common name. It'll suck the spit right out of your mouth. A great replacement for euonymus. Takes full sun, takes fairly heavy shade. Moist soils, great for a rain garden setting. White flowers in the spring, Nice leaves all summer, great fall color. You're starting to see a bit of it. Black chokeberry has black fruit that will persist into the winter, while red chokeberry has red fruit, tends to be taller. Birds wait till these ferment on the plant before they come and feed on them. You can make wines, jams, and jellies out of these, picking them at the right sugar balance, and then, anything you add sugar or ferment is going to taste good. Just the fall color on the left, look at how intense that is. Again, the more shade, the less intense, but even in a shady spot, these will put on some good show. Little fragrance. If you know viburnum, Korean spice viburnum, you could smell those flowers. It's not native. Our native viburnums have been really struggling with viburnum leaf beetle. And so the Korean is resistant to that, but rabbits do like it. Look at those flower buds. Isn't that beautiful? The Spice Island is a compact variety. More information on this on your handout. So you've got the flower buds, you've got the fragrance, you've got the flowers with a little pink tinge. The fall color is beautiful. So you see the open flowers on the left and the fall color on the right. And I'll tell you, this is one the rabbits always look for at my garden every winter. So I do some granular plant skid around the base. Double file viburnum. Look at that horizontal branching. The flowers aren't fragrant, but they put on quite a show. You want to give this room so that it has plenty of space to really spread out those branches because the year-round appeal comes from its form. Good fall color, nice spring bloom. I won't say much about red twig dogwood. Full sun to shade, and I know I'm going fast, so bear with me. Moist to wet, soggy soils, native to marshy areas. Tons of varieties out there, some that are more confined to 3 or 4 feet, some that get much taller. They tend to colonize, so you'll get a nice stand of them. They're color coded, so when the older branches turn brown, prune those out, make way for the newer bright red branches. Flowers in the spring, good red twig color in the winter, nice purpley fall color, and fruit the birds enjoy. So it's really a multi-season shrub that will tolerate shade. Garden glows become one of my favorite. This is when the planting was young at our state fair park. They get to be 4 or 5 feet tall and wide. The reason I like it is in the spring, you can see these bright yellow leaves. They turn more of a lime or a chartreuse as summer progresses. But you've got the white flowers, the red stems, like your red twig. You've got reddish fall color, but in the spring, that bright kind of lime green chartreuse just brightens up the spring garden. Carolina allspice. For northerners, this really reminds me of a tropical plant, fragrant, hardy to zone 4. It can grow quite large. The sample on the right, I think, was at this is at Will Radler's house, but I saw an 8-foot tall one at Green Bay Botanic Garden. Fragrant flowers. The seed pods are somewhat ornamental. The leaves are very big and tropical, but nice, wonderful kind of fruity fragrance. Smooth hydrangea. Not going to say much. I've done seminars on webinars on just hydrangeas. These bloom on new growth. So if they die back or you prune them back to the ground, you'll still get blooms. Most are green that turn white, then green, then brown. The Invincible Spirit will be pink no matter the soil pH. And then there's a new green one, and Flowerful from Bailey's is supposed to be even more floriferous and more of a reliable bloomer. But the traditional shade hydrangea. Here it is with hawkcone grass. You can see a little bit of the flowers. I think they're pretty. Some people call them insignificant. I think it adds another texture and a little pink tinge. Meadowsweet, and more upright, shade tolerant, moist to wet soils. Blooms late May into June, and very tolerant of moist soils and a long blooming, great for pollinators. Light, nice, kind of fluffy flower heads. Our native New Jersey tea is a nice shrub that grows 3 feet or more tall. First time I saw it was in Nicolet National Forest in the middle of the forest. So that tells you it prefers moist, well-drained soils, but in the middle of a forest, it can be quite dry and pretty heavy shade. Full sun, part shade, as you can see, a pollinator favorite. And just a picture of the overall shrub. Our native bush honeysuckle, it's not a true honeysuckle, not the invasive one. Look at those arching branches. So they're great on a hillside, great for erosion control, just an area where you want that nice arching branches to kind of soften that appearance. Yellow flowers in the summer, the hummingbirds and pollinators like, and good fall, purple fall color. The Kodiak series really does best in full sun, but as you can see here, it's getting a fair amount of shade because the hawkcone grass looks okay. Um, it's a fast grower and it's big. I grow mine in full sun and I've even divided them, which you typically don't divide shrubs because they took over the space I gave them. Cool Splash is one that benefits from shade in the afternoon. It can scorch out if it's too hot. A lower grower, 3 feet tall or so with variegated foliage. So a nice one to brighten up those shady areas as a facer shrub in front of taller ones. Summer bloomers, summer sweet, a native plant. Flowers in the summer, fragrant flowers, hummingbirds, butterflies, bees, and other pollinators love. You can find shorter varieties to taller ones, mostly white flowers, but there are some pink blooms as well, yellow fall color. I also like Virginia sweet spire. Now, it does like a little bit of acidic soil, but it will tolerate alkaline soil, just won't be as vigorous. And it does tend to sucker, so that's okay in my book. Summer fragrant flowers, hummingbirds and pollinators love, and this is why I like it so much. Check out that fall color. It is brilliant red. Even in some heavy shade, I was growing mine in the city. And so a nice rounded shrub, and so you'll have the stems for some winter framework. Elderberry, aggressive, so give it room, vigorous, grown for the flowers, good for pollinators. They are edible. People make syrup. The fruit, you can make wine and other beverages from them or jams and jelly. It's a tall plant. Don't eat too many of the raw berries. They are poisonous. They have cyanide, much like apple seeds do. But if you eat too many, you can get very sick. Otherwise, make them into jams and jellies or leave them for the birds, but give them room to grow. They will tolerate drier soil once established. So they're great rain garden plants if you've got one that's big enough. And just a close up of the fruit. St. John's wort, I'm going to talk about calms, which you see here. And they have yellow flowers in the summer. Many have blue-green leaves, seeds that persist over winter. This is another native shrubby St. John's wort. What I love is it blooms in the summer and it's covered with bees. You go out, mine are just buzzing with the bees all summer long. So it's a great bee plant. Only grows about 2 to 4 feet tall and wide, and just a nice addition to the summer bloom. Buttonbush. We did a Melinda's Garden Moment video on summer blooming shrubs, and we were at a friend's nursery, and her buttonbush was covered with butterflies and bees and hummingbirds nectaring on those summer flowers. Those round flowers turn red and then brown, and then songbirds and small mammals will eat the seeds over winter, and you'll get a little ornamental appeal. Just an overview of this plant. The straight species is pretty tall, but there's some shorter, more compact ones like Sugar Shack and Pink and Pong as well. Bottle brush Buckeye. You want something big for the shade? This is the plant for you. Blooms in the summer, spikes of flowers, great for hummingbirds and butterflies. Mine's on a woodland edge, pretty heavy shade. The deer have nibbled it once in a while, but don't seem to be that interested. And then the fall color is yellow. You may get some buckeyes. Usually the squirrels take care of them. I'm in the north, so I don't see a lot. I'm on kind of near I'm a zone 5, maybe 4. And so I get a few fruit when the season's long, but boy, nothing beats that show and a big plant. So if you want to fill some shady spaces, that's one to consider. Oak leaf hydrangea flowers on old wood. And even if you're in the north and you don't get flowers reliably, look at the interesting shape of the leaves. They've got kind of a little velvety appearance as well that turns this beautiful fall color, oranges, reds, maroon. The flowers start out white, fade to pink, or they also fade like ruby slippers to a nice ruby red. I leave the seed heads on for winter for added winter interest. And one of the cool things about this plant is it has orange exfoliating peeling bark. So even when the leaves drop, you've got that nice texture and color in the winter garden. Deer do like hydrangeas, so keep that in mind. And then just as those flowers fade later in the season. Winterberry, grown for the fruit, or Michigan holly, if I have any Michigan garden friends out there, you need one male for every 1 to 5 female to get fruit. The flowers aren't that showy, and I'll show you a picture now. You got to look close for the male parts to see if you have a male or female, but it's all about the fruit. So after the leaves drop, you've got this fruit persisting. Takes moist to wet soil, likes it more acidic. I've seen it pushed into more alkaline soil and do okay, not as vigorous, but remember, one male for every 1 to 5 female plants. And we're ending the shrub season with what we started, another hamamelis or witch hazel. This is the common witch hazel. When that yellow fall color, when those leaves drop, they reveal the spicy, fragrant, strappy yellow blooms. So it's kind of a nice way to end the season, right? So you have this big plant that will take sun to shade, moist to dry soils once established. You get that burst of yellow fall color, the leaves drop, and you see the flowers. End the season with that nice hurrah. It's a big plant, so give it some space. Takes a year when the seeds ripen, they shoot out away from the parent plant. So now we're going to transition to some larger shrubs or often considered small trees. And I only have a few left, so hang in there with me. Redbud. If you're in the north, you want to look for a hardy strain like Columbus, Minnesota, or some of the new ones like Pink Trim out of North Dakota. You want to make sure they're reliably hardy. For those of you down south, less of an issue. But the blooms are edible. They appear right on the branches and the trunk, so they're very showy. You get nice heart-shaped leaves for the summer and yellow fall color. The fruit look like dry pea pods hanging from the tree. Some people like them, some people say it's messy, but it's a lower growing, spreading tree. I'm so excited. It's taken me years to find a source for northern spicebush, Lindera. Some nature centers, if they do a wildflower sale, may sell these. Check with your local nursery. I had to mail order mine because I've been looking for years. Yellow flowers, fragrant flowers early in the spring. You can see just as the leaves are starting to break. Nice foliage all season long. It turns yellow in the fall, and fruit you and the birds can enjoy. So it's a great pollinator plant, great for songbirds, and just a great shade tolerant plant. I've seen it in pretty heavy shade at our botanic garden doing quite well. I list several different service berries. I won't talk a lot, but you can see the spring bloom, the fruit, and the fall color, and the bark is smooth and gray, so it adds to the winter interest. Carolina silver bell. Oh, how can you beat those flowers? I think it's rated zone 4 hardy, but I would put it in a sheltered spot if you were zone 4, even in zone 5. If you're in the Milwaukee area, there's a great mature specimen of this at the Forest Home Cemetery, and I think there's still one at the Berner Botanical Gardens right near the peonies. And I think there's one at UW Arboretum too. So you might want to check those out. But once the flowers are gone, the spring blooms are gone, you've got those interesting seed pods that dry up. So again, I'm a northern gardener, so dried seed pods add winter interest for me. A little bit of golden or yellow fall color. I grew up in Ohio and missed the flowering dogwoods, and I know they have some issues with anthracnose. Coosa dogwood is hardy to zone 5. I'm in a zone 5-4. I've seen these in Milwaukee area. I heard there's some growing in the Madison area as well. But check out those fruit. They're edible. The birds love them. So we've got the blooms, which are really the bracts. The white things are the bracts. The flowers are the green knobby thing. You've got that nice foliage, and then purpley in the fall, an interesting fruit, something very different. Our native pagoda dogwood has horizontal branching, adding to its year-round interest. White flowers after the leaves emerge, fruit Blue fruit, the birds eat but leave the red pedicel, and purpley fall color. It has to have moist soil, best with shade from the afternoon sun. In full sun, mulch those roots. Make sure it gets plenty of water, maybe even a ground cover to keep the roots cool and moist, or use it in that shady location. It's a nice addition to the shade garden. American bladderwort can be short-lived, tends to form a thicket, is great for those shady areas, hard to grow areas that you may be looking for something native. Great for pollinators. And it does have, they look like little bladders, the fruit. So kind of interesting, a native plant for shady spots. Wafer ash, the fruit look like those like you see on an elm. It's a disc with a seed in the middle. That's why it's called wafer ash. You crush the leaves, they kind of smell. The flowers are not nice smelling. Some fall color, but what I like about this is sun or shade, wet or dry soil. So if you have a difficult spot, I have sandy soil and a property I'm not always able to keep watered like I should. I've got to add some of these because I like the pollinator appeal. I like the seasonal interest. I like its adaptability and its ability to tolerate some pretty tough conditions. Our native musclewood, an understory tree, so it's made for the shade. It will take full sun, moist, well-drained soil. The flowers, you can see the fruit on the upper right, little nutlets with winged appendages that persist into winter, so kind of like ornaments. The one on the left, you can sort of see them in amongst the leaves. Fall color can be yellow, orange, or red. Johnson Nursery, and I mentioned those varieties, selected for good red fall color. Otherwise, pick them out at the nursery in the fall and buy it in the spring. And then the bark looks like flex mussels, thus the name. Another understory native tree is ironwood. That bark looks like, like a pillar where the pane is crackling. That's what the bark looks like. Very strong and sturdy bark. On the left, you see the fruit, sometimes called hop hornbeam because it looks like hops. It's little nutlets in among those puffy, papery coverings. And again, something the birds will go after. So another one, it'll take full sun, a little more drought tolerant than musclewood. We use these as street trees at a couple locations in Milwaukee, but great for those part shade. I've seen both of those in fairly heavy shade. Just a couple more. Acer griseum, paper bark maple. You may think it looks sick. I think that cinnamon bark and that texture when it peels is great. I would put this in a somewhat sheltered location if you're in the north. We had one growing at the MATC North Campus, and it was in an atrium area, very sheltered. It was huge and doing great. We had some growing on boulevards in downtown Milwaukee as well, which tended to be a little more moderate than the further away from the lake. Look at the fall color on that plant. So interesting leaf shape and beautiful red fall color and the bark to give you year-round interest. I'm going to add one of these to my landscape. I'm seeing the flowers. I think this was at Rotary Garden, striped maple. Look at that chain of flowers. Not many maples. You recognize the flowers, you see them, they're early. And so, yeah, they make an impact, but look at that. And then picture this with tiny little samaras, those little helicopters all on that chain. So very ornamental. So nice foliage, interesting flowers, interesting fruit, and you've got that nice bark for year-round interest. And this one takes heavy shade. So if you want a maple for heavy shade, this would be a good one. Just 3 evergreens to talk about. Russian cypress, not native. This is one plant that you see here. It only grows like 8 to 12 inches tall, but can spread to 12 feet wide. Now, in the winter, it turns bronze. Don't freak out. It's not dead. It will green back up in the spring. To me, it looks like an arborvitae foliage with the growth habit of a creeping juniper. I have one of these in a shady area, not a lot of care, and it's doing great. The more shade you give them, the more open the growth habit. Shelter from winter wind and winter sun is always a good idea for any of your evergreens, especially if you're in a climate where the winters are cold or in the south where the summer sun can be drying, but at least you can water we can't. So if your ground freezes, shelter from winter wind and winter sun. Hemlocks, wonderful plants, nice, graceful. There are many, many dwarf cultivars. Here you see Gench white. See the new growth has kind of got a white tinge. There's Moonfrost, which is more rounded. If you are in an area where hemlock woolly adelgid is a problem, don't add hemlocks. I've included information on that pest, and I've also included information on some management strategies in case you have hemlocks and in case you have the problem. Pennsylvania State University does a great job of sharing research. Often, I'm a northern Midwesterner, so often those problems start on the southeast or east coast and move west. Some start on the west coast and move east. And so checking out the university, always your university and your university extension. But if you know there's a problem, I've been tuning into a lot of the Pennsylvania State University webinars because they're addressing a lot of concerns, diseases, and insect problems I'm worried are going to make their way to my state. So check those out. But it is a beautiful, one of the best shade tolerant evergreens. I know I went through a lot of plants quickly. I tried to cut them back. Hopefully, maybe we'll do a two-parter next year. I want to thank Diggers Hotline, and remember, call 811 if you're not in anywhere in the country, or go to Diggers Hotline, file online in Wisconsin, or 811 anywhere in the country. They send utility companies to locate the underground utilities in your work area. We want you safe. Making sure they're marked so you avoid them will help keep you safe. Avoid inconvenience. Somebody told me their neighbor kept cutting the cable line and knocking out their internet. No one will be happy. And if you damage it, you have to pay for it if you did not have it marked. As long as it was marked, you're not responsible, but we want to keep you safe and we really don't want it damaged. My contact information is on the handout. If you've been emailing me questions, be patient. I'm almost past the biggest crunch getting up and running this year. So be patient, email again. Join me for future webinars. I didn't add one. I'm speaking at Grosse Pointe at the War Memorial Saturday, March 8th. There's still space available. I think it was just added to my website. So hope I could see if you're in Michigan, in the Detroit area, join me there. It should be fun. You'll be seeing more of me if you check out the library program. Once again, We Energies is sponsoring webinars, videos, and activities. There's a link to that, all that's coming up in that. Last but not least, please help me grow gardeners. Somebody inspired you to garden, whether it's a youngster in your life, or it could be a young family down the street, or a new retiree. I want to grow a kinder and gentler world, one garden and gardener at a time. And to do that, I'm going to need your help. So help share the joy of gardening. Well, I'm 12 minutes over. Sorry, Kelly. And I know I talked really fast. And please, the handout's got lots of details for you to use as a reference. So hopefully I gave you like, oh, I like that plant, circle that. Oh, that was good. So that you could do a little more research and cross out the ones you don't like.
Thank you so much, Melinda. So as a reminder to everyone, please share your questions in the Q&A if you haven't done so already. And also we are recording this session, so we'll send out the link to that in a couple of days, and you'll be able to rewatch this if there are any parts that maybe you didn't get your notes on. So you can review the recording of this, and we'll also send out that handout in email as well. So
Thank you.
definitely. All right, so let's jump in. So I'm going to go to our Q&A box here. Got a question from Robin. Robin says, I love hostas, but the deer destroy them. How do I deal with this problem?
Deer and rabbits love hostas probably even more than we do. So a couple things that I do. I work with, so I want to disclose this Plant Skid. It's an organic, rain and snow resistant, odor-based repellent. I don't find it obnoxious, and I think my sense of smell is okay. I like to use the granular, sprinkled on the soil surface water to help settle it in, but it's rain resistant, so you don't have to replace it every time it rains. treating with whatever repellent you choose before they start feeding. So we know they love the hostas. Treat just as you're starting to see them coming up. And that's a great way to manage it. You may need to do a second application. We're also finding there are so many baby bunnies last year, and they haven't learned to be afraid of that smell that using the liquid, which leaves a little red residue temporarily, but eventually fades along with the granular, may help. Um, even temporarily, we want to look at their beauty. So you probably don't want to fence them in, and especially deer can reach over. So whatever repellent you choose, read and follow label directions, and then apply before they start eating whenever possible. So they take a whiff and they move on somewhere else.
I'm gonna try that actually this year on my hostas. I have a rabbit problem for
Oh,
sure, so I'll report
yes.
back.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Alright, so our next question is from Lynn. Lynn's asking, my hellebore leaves seem to be all brown this year. Do I cut them off?
You can, if Lynn, if you are, I think you're in this area. So if you are in anywhere in the north or even the upper Midwest, we've had a dry end of the summer. We had hot, cold, hot, cold. So if they're brown and dried, these are not, they're skinny stems, so they're not the homes for pollinators. You can cut them off whenever I think we're going to have 50 some degrees tomorrow. So, you could cut those off, or you might want to wait till the new growth emerges, whatever's easiest for you. The good news is we like to wait till wait as long as you can to cut back your perennials, especially those with hollow stems. The leaves may be providing some insulation for some of the insects overwintering, but in the ground or toads and frogs that are underneath the ground. But you can start cleanup as those leaves emerge. You want to definitely show off those flowers to their fullest.
It's going out of order briefly
Okay.
here. Linda's asking, what was the name again of the deer repellent?
It's Plant Skyd, PLANTSKYDD, developed in Europe, and I think it was in Sweden. And so Plant Skyd means plant protector. And so the skid part is the protector. Plant Skyd, SKYDD. I haven't, depending, you might check with your garden center, your local garden center. Not all of them carry it. I usually order mine online, either directly from Plant Skyd or, Amazon sells everything from food to Plant Skyd. So wherever you're comfortable, but I've had great success with the liquid on the taller plants. The granular is great for things near the ground where rabbits, bulls, chipmunks, and deer reaching their head down to munch on them. Works very well.
Next question is from Stephanie. Stephanie asks, what is a good shade plant, I assume, under an arborvitae?
That's a great question, Stephanie. And one of the things I'll challenge you with is to look at where the light comes in and how big the arborvitae. If it's, on the outer edge, it may be getting a lot of light. I had a big street tree on the west side of my house in Milwaukee. But, when the sun was going down, I got quite a bit of sunlight under the canopy of that tree. Now, I'm assuming you're not depending if the deer have eaten your arborvitae up, you might need a lot of something underneath it. Ginger is very shade and drought tolerant, very low growing. You could go with a sedge or the hawkone grass. That's going to give you some nice texture and a more of a mounded appearance and a little taller. Um, the Siberian bugloss is about 12 inches tall. Depending on how big of a plant you're looking for, some of the sedges are quite tall too, so that might be an option as well. I'm trying to think of some of those mid-sized plants. Depending on how big you want it. Um, I'll tell you that Corydalus, I love that yellow flower I showed. I didn't talk about it, but it does reseed readily, but that would be pretty because it takes sun or shade. So depending on the light, it's got nice texture and yellow blooms all summer. So check out Corydalus lutea, Lutea, I think I spelled that right. Google will correct me. But it's one that reseeds readily. But I would check that out. That might be a pretty one, that blue-green under your arborvitae.
I just want to remind everyone, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A box. And I'll keep moving here. Cindy is asking about, let's
Oh,
see, I understand double blooms of cultivars and nativars are not as easily utilized by pollinators.
good point. So a couple of things. I was just found out there's been some more recent research finding that many, especially they're doing it on trees and shrubs as well as perennials, doing some research, finding that even our non-natives that we see lots of pollinators on, they're not only checking and pollinators visit them, but that they are as nutritious as our native plants. When you do a double flower, when you have a double flower, there's less of the nectar producing parts of the flower, and it's a little harder for the pollinators to access. So, yeah, if you really want to maximize your pollinator appeal, those things that are single flowers are better. And again, if you're growing perennials, you probably see lots of pollinators on those, even the non-native ones. And so they're finding that it's not as bad as we thought with the cultivars of natives or cultivated plants. But again, that's the choice you're going to make. But you're right, definitely the single ones, more nectar and pollen and easier access. So good point.
Got a question from Jessica. Jessica is looking for suggestions for under spruce or pine trees that range from wet to dry conditions and would get west sun.
Okay, so that was exactly my case. I had a Norway maple street tree, dense shade. I mentioned on the spruce tree that Canadian ginger worked very well. It does like moist, well-drained soil, but once established, takes it dry. Coral bells, I've had good success with. Again, the key is getting a good root system established with proper watering the first couple years. Siberian bug loss, Brunnera, also works well. I've had good luck with Solomon seal. We used it at our state fair garden. Weird thing happened though. It finally took off. It was right under this crabapple, and there's a lot of shade in that area, and it was, dry. And it was a huge clump. And we came back last year to do the maintenance in June and it was gone. There was no sign of it. I was sure somebody came and dug it up, but there was no sign that that happened either. It just died, which I've never heard of before. So who knows what happened? But that's another good one. Astilbe's just like too much moisture, and I'm just concerned that it won't, when you get that dry and that west sunlight's going to be too much. But those are all, and even fringe bleeding heart, but I would put them in a way where they're not getting that hot afternoon sun. So maybe behind them a bit. I didn't mention toad lily. Toad lily is a fall bloomer. It has orchid-like tiny flowers on stems, blooms late in the season. So if you're in the north, sometimes the frost in the fall kills them. But boy, I used that under my Norway maple and it was gorgeous. And it was right by the walkway and people would stop and look at it. So ginger, I would do some of the sedges. Some are tolerant of both. I would do some coral bells. Foam flower is similar growing conditions, and it has some nice leaves and bottle brush type white flowers. Those would be some I would start with. And then the Siberian bug gloss should do well for you there too.
Thank you.
Oh, nice.
So our next question, I know I'm going to mispronounce this plant name,
Okay.
so please correct me. This is from Jane. Jane is asking, is the Haklo,
Hakonocloa.
that was it, is that invasive?
I have not seen reports of it being invasive. It's more of a clump grower. Um, I always try to check plants before, it's always changing. We're finding out new things. I have never heard of it. It doesn't reseed readily. It it's a clumper, and so it needs moist, well-drained soil and some shade. I always go to invasives.org to make sure, just to make sure that it isn't. You might want to double check. I'm not offended. I have not seen it as listed as invasive when I've checked. And I haven't seen it be aggressive in the garden either. Some of the gardens I showed you with big plantings, they started with a fair number of plants. Meyer Garden in Grand Rapids, Michigan, put that on your list. Cool garden. Oh, just amazing and great sculptures. Had a huge planting of it. It was just beautiful. But they plenty of water, good conditions, and started with a few plants. Good question. Always check. Thanks.
Next question is from Judy. Judy says, I have the hardy begonia on the north side of my home. It's got beautiful foliage and flowers. Actually, I think that was more of a
Judy,
comment.
let us know where you're from, because hardy begonia, I don't think is hardy. I've never seen it make it. Sorry, don't get excited, Kelly. We're not, you're closer to the lake than me, but I think it's
Yeah.
more of a zone 6 plant. So Judy, that's great. You bring up a good point. Obviously, I focused on a lot of plants that would do well, some in zone 3, some in 4, some in 5. I tried to include some for 6, 7, 8, and 9 as well. But thank you for mentioning that, Judy. So if you're in a milder climate, check that one out because it is a beautiful plant. Thanks, Judy. Oh, I'm okay.
Oh,
Sorry, I'm cheating. I'm looking at the
Oh.
questions too.
I did
Try
like
to
your
get a head
real-time
start.
reaction. Yeah. So our next one is from Stephanie, and I know we talked about plants to put underneath arborvitaes, but Stephanie's asking about a good shade plant that would complement the acidity that comes from being by an arborvitae.
I am so glad you asked that question because there's a lot of misinformation on the internet saying that the needles from pine trees, spruces, and arborvitae make the soil too acidic. It isn't true. Our soils in much of the Midwest and the North are very alkaline or sweet. We wish it made it more acidic. It really does not affect it. Why don't things grow under those evergreens? Because the evergreen shades it. Then the needles that drop, because they lose their old needles, shades the soil like a mulch. In fact, at State Fair Park, we have a lot of arborvitae, and we'll rake the excess needles out that have dried up and fallen and use them as a mulch in some of our flower beds just to recycle and repurpose them. So any of those things I talked about would do fine. Acidity is not an issue because of the arborvitae. Now, if your soils tend to be acidic, you could do bearberry. That's a nice woody, low-growing plant that's native with flowers and fruit. Bearberry. You could do the bunchberry, which is a type of a dogwood, and I think it's Cornus canadensis, I think it is, which I'd love to grow, but my soil's a little too alkaline. And it's a low grower, has the same kind of dogwood flowers. It makes a nice ground cover. That one will take as a nice low growing one too, can take that slightly acidic soil. And we're talking, and most of the plants I talked, unless you have a really, really low acidity, most of them will do well as a ground cover in those areas. I'm glad you asked that question. Thanks.
Next question is from Denise. Denise is wondering, is Nanking cherry shrubs, or are they short-lived?
So they tend to be somewhat short-lived. Cherries, depending on where you live, most of the prunus, the cherries, the apricots, the peaches, the plums, ornamental and fruit, are often short-lived. They like moist, well-drained soils. They don't tolerate early spring or late spring frost or early spring frost. So if you live in an area that's subject to late spring frost, you often lose the flowers. They're subject to several borer insects that can kill them and gummosis, a disease. Usually those things happen when the plant is stressed. So depending on where you live, moist, well-drained soils is critical. I have peaches that I've harvested. I probably need to start my next crop, but I have them on a north-facing slope, so that cold air sinks below, and I've had pretty good luck growing and having pretty decent harvest unless we get a really bad late spring frost. So don't be, yes, they can be short-lived. So a long answer to your question, sorry.
Got a follow-up from Judy. Judy was asking or sharing about the
Begonia.
begonia. Yeah, Judy said that she's right outside of St. Louis, Missouri.
Okay,
So
so oh, we're jealous, Judy.
yeah.
So I left Columbus, Ohio, and moved north. So I sometimes go home and see, oh, I couldn't grow that anymore, and I can't grow that anymore. So thank you for sharing, Judy. You guys have a wonderful botanic garden down in St. Louis too. So put that on my list to go visit.
Sherry's our next question. Sherry's asking, do you have shade plant recommendations for heavy clay soil?
You know, hostas actually thrive pretty well in clay soil. I've been pretty impressed. Some of your ferns will do okay. I mean, a couple things that I would suggest, and hellebores, you got to find the right spot. One of the things, if you've got an area you're struggling with, one of the things I would do is try a couple of plants. Some of the sedges will take it too. I would try a couple plants, and the ones that do well, okay, if you've seen that one, if you go places, you often see these doing well with it. Um, I've seen Canadian ginger do well in clay. That friend of mine had it under her spruce tree. She lives in Mequon, where the soil is like clay that you could make pottery from, and that's done well. Um, you know, depending on what you're dealing with, if it's under a tree, you may not want to do a lot of heavy amending, but what you could do is called vertical mulching, where you could spread a layer of compost over the soil surface like an inch. It's different than soil, right? It breaks down, the insects take it into the ground. Then take your auger bit on your drill and drill aeration holes around that pushes some of the compost through so it gets to the roots of the plant, helps amending the soil. It will help your trees as well if you're concerned about them because you're not disrupting the whole root system, but just sporadically taking out some of those fine feeder roots. Um, I've had good luck with that Corylus. I guess I should have included it, but it reseeds readily. I haven't seen that was invasive. I checked, but it reseeds readily. Um, I would say I've had decent luck with bleeding heart. It's also black walnut resistant, which I put on the handout if I found those. So I would take a look at hawcone grass. Maybe would do okay for you, but I think sedges or hawcone grass. Check out the Canadian ginger. Um, the Siberian bug loss, I think, would be a good one. My only concern about coral bells is their frost heaving. And in clay soil, that might be an issue a little more so than well-drained sandy soil, just because of the freezing and thawing of the soil. But I would start with those and then I'd see how those do. Foam flower, Tiarella might be another one to give a try. And Solomon seal. I've seen that in pretty heavy clay soil do well.
Our next question's from Jane. Jane says, I have an old Corin spice in part shade. Last year it did not bloom well. Uh, it did not bloom well last year. When is the best time to prune the shrub?
Good question. So it blooms on, it's already set its flower buds for next spring. So you want to wait till after it flowers. You'll sacrifice the fruit, but they don't make that much fruit. Um, I would check and make sure the rabbits are not eating the flower buds or the tips of the branches because they'll stand up on their hind legs, but you'd probably just see that missing at the bottom and you should see the flowers on top. You know, the weather has been crazy depending on where you live. Um, if if it's in an older plant and it's in a garden bed that hasn't been fertilized, you might want to fertilize. I work with Milorganite. I like to disclose that. It's low nitrogen, slow release, so it won't interfere with flowering. It contains non-leaching phosphorus. And research found when the microorganisms worked on releasing the nutrients from the Milorganite pellets, it released some of the phosphorus, good for flowering, and some of the potassium, good for hardiness and disease resistance from the soil. And this research was done at the University of Florida. So I like if I want to nudge a plant, a shrub, I don't fertilize a lot. I have sandy soil and my plants do well. But if I feel they need a little something, the reason I like Milorganite, it's low nitrogen, slow release. And so I know I'm not going to overdo it, end up with lush succulent growth that diseases and insects are more likely to attack or interfere with the blooms that I've been waiting to get. So you might want to give it a shot of, if you don't want to use Milorganite, an organic fertilizer or one that's low nitrogen, slow release to avoid problems with interfering with flowering. But I think it maybe just needs a little nudge in its bloom time. If it's dense and covered and full, it may not be getting enough light penetration towards the center, but you still should have some blossoms. And then always monitor the weather. Sometimes buds are swelling, and since the buds form over winter, if we had a warm spell, the buds may start to break early, and then we get a cold snap and it killed those flower buds. And that can really interfere with those plants that form their flower buds the preceding year. So it could be weather related as well. So kind of tracking the weather is important.
So Jane is wondering, how early should we apply a pre-emergent?
So depending on Jane, where you're applying it, if you're applying it to your lawn, pre-emergence prevent seeds from germinating. That includes grass seeds. It includes good seeds. So if you're using a pre-emergent in your lawn, we usually say when the Van Hoot spirea bloom, which that's what some people call bridal wreath. I always say you start seeing the forsythia bloom in your area, start getting ready and apply soon after that. Um, that's to control crabgrass and then some of the summer annuals in the lawn. Now, when you're using a pre-emergent in your garden beds, you want to make sure that you're not counting on any of those flower seeds sprouting. So I'm a procrastinator, low input gardener. And so I like to take advantage of things that reseed. I've had annual salvias reseed. I've had my celosia reseed. So by delaying cleanup, not only do I give the pollinators a chance to leave, but I can kind of see what's sprouting. So I tend not to use pre-emergence in my flower beds. Check the label. If you're using one in your flower beds, preen is probably the most popular pre-emergent, but they also have formulations that have total vegetation killers and other things. So check the label, and that should tell you what weed you're trying to control, and you do it before they sprout. So depending, and you always want to be careful in a flower garden or a vegetable garden that you're not preventing the seeds you want to germinate. So I hope that helps.
Thank you. And we've got a few more questions here. Amy is asking, so this is unrelated to what we talked about tonight, but Amy's wondering what the best resource would be to have about jumping worms. I think we've talked about that in some other
Yeah,
webinars.
that is a whole webinar, but there's kind of good news. University of Wisconsin Landscape Arboretum, if you Google that and jumping worms, there was a professor that gave a great webinar, and it's still available, I think, on YouTube on jumping worms. University of Maryland I've been trying to track these two. What I found out from the University of Maryland, because so many of us are nervous about adding mulch and compost to our garden that we're bringing in jumping worms, they found if you put plastic down and then fill it with a 6 or 8 inch layer of mulch or compost, then form a little pocket, close it up, and then let it heat up. So it needs to be in a sunny place where it reaches temperatures of 105 degrees. UW says 104. They say 105 for 3 days. You kill the eggs, the cocoon, and the jumping worm adults. That's great because then you're not adding more. In the garden, heat doesn't really work because if it's an isolated bed, you could do that for the jumping worms, just leave and then come back after the heat's down. But at least not adding more and then reliable sources. I know the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources has great brochures on jumping worms. Check out that. University of Maryland, I found their information helpful. And I'm trying to remember where else, but most universities are starting to address that issue as it's progressing through the country a little more. So, yeah, it's a tough one. And hopefully, they're looking at trying to find some possible options. There is I think it's called Botanigard which is very expensive, that does a 90% kill rate on the jumping worms. Ground mustard will bring them and earthworms to the surface so you can collect them and get rid of them. So that's all pretty much out there. If you have trouble finding it, info@melindamyers.com, and I'll try to start next week. I have some time to catch up on my correspondence. So info@melindamyers.com, I'll dig up some links to some of those resources. And if maybe I'm just put out my newsletter's coming out. It's in the edit stages. So Dawn's making it beautiful as we speak, probably. But maybe I'll post something on Facebook and in my next newsletter coming out sometime in March. I'll do something on jumping worms. It's been a while. So thanks for asking.
Marty is asking, when should I plant hellebores in my garden?
You know, whenever you can find them at the garden center. So spring is a great time as long as you can keep things watered. If you're in an area subject to drought, really hot summers and dry summers, or you have limited availability of water, late summer, fall plantings are great because it tends to be cooler. Sometimes we have more rain. Last fall in our neck of the woods, we didn't. But, I like to get things in early in the season when I could get them at the garden center. But I'll tell you honestly, I planted stuff in the summer because that's when I had time. The key is good care after you get them in the ground. First year or two, perennials need, and shrubs and trees need good regular watering. So if we don't get the rainfall, you need to supplement to get that robust root system established. Great question.
We have a follow-up from Caroline about
Oh,
the jumping worms. Caroline says, if you keep your plastic bags of mulch in the direct sun for a few days, that would kill the potential jumping worms that might be in the mulch.
right. And make sure there aren't holes because a lot of the bagged mulches have holes in them so that they breathe. So you definitely maybe throw a plastic tarp over it, but a great suggestion. I was thinking bulk mulch, but a lot of times bagged mulch is easier to manage. So thank you for that suggestion. Just make sure there are no holes or wrap it again.
So let's see, next question from Debbie. Debbie says, you mentioned some, but can you talk about perennials that do well in containers?
I'm doing a talk to the commercial flower growers on just that topic, perennials for containers, next fall. So maybe I'll do it as a webinar next year. But here are some things. Really, any perennial will do okay. The key is, what are you going to do with it at the end of the season? If you're in a mild climate, you can leave it out. If you're in a cold climate like I am, you could move it into an unheated garage or put it in your garden and buy new plants next year. So some that I find look really great: hawcone grass, Haconocloa, and sedges give you that grassy, airy filler look. I mentioned Siberian bug loss. Hostas in a pot under a shade tree, you get that elevation, so you increase that vertical interest. I saw that first at Inniswood Gardens in Columbus, Ohio, and they had them in big clay pots. They were gorgeous, and so they work very well. Coral bells work great. That's another good one. Solomon seal I've seen used in a container. You want to get a fairly decent sized transplant, like on a 4-inch pot or 6-inch, so you have some decent stems to add that vertical interest, but you'd have vertical interest all season, so it'd be nice upright growth. Ferns work great in containers for shady areas as well. Tiarella, which is foam flower, I've used that in a container and that works great. Going down through my head of shade tolerant, but you're probably used to using a lot of sun lovers in pots as well. So those are some. Really, about anything will work. Think about the foliage though. If it's a spring bloomer, is it going to look good in the summer? Or maybe you leave it in its pot, sink it in the big container garden. Once it's done blooming, take it out, replace it with something that blooms in the summer, and make it a little more changeable, easier on those plant roots and you as well. You guys are giving me great ideas for future topics.
So next question from Marty. Marty is wondering if you have any suggestions for what to plant under a large oak tree. I've tried fern, a silby, longwort, and nothing seems to thrive. My garden center suggested mulch. Thank you.
So again, Marty, I think the key is going to be getting them established those first couple of years. Astilbe's a pretty good moisture lover, unless you did the Chinensis, which tolerates dry soils a little better. I'd take that one off the list. Lungwort does tend to scorch. I have some in an area where if it's too dry, I get a little scorch happening. Um, I, you know what I would do is I'd start from the edge. I would mulch, but I would then start planting from the edge going back where they're getting maybe a little more rain, maybe they're getting a more light. Hostas, the Canadian ginger, some of your sedges, that Pennsylvania sedge, that's the one you see in the woods popping up. I do that Pennsylvania sedge. Check that Sensational Sedges handout from Mark Dwyer. And Mark, my apologies but I'm sharing it because you're such a good plants person. It's a great resource I'm using a lot now. But some of your sedges will take dry shade. I would check those out. Um, I would, yeah, I think those would be some of the good ones to start with. Think about what you see. The ephemerals would be coming out early, so it'd give you some, but then they would fade away in the summer, so be less, less beautifying. I'm trying to think of what I saw, but I would try the sedges. I would try hosta. I would try the ginger. I'd even try some Siberian bug loss, but I'd try a few plants of each. As you get success, then I would start adding to it. So the mulch will help keep the weeds down. These will help you kind of decide what will do well based on the care you can provide and those specific growing conditions. Oh, and epimedium, barrenwort takes dry shade. That's a good one under arborvitae, if our arborvitae friends are still listening. So that barrenwort, epimedium, that would be a great one. It takes dry shade very well.
Another question about Astilbe. Deborah is sharing that I planted 6 2 years ago, all flowered the first year, but then last year only 2 flowered. They're under a maple tree, so it's shady. Should I move them to a sunnier spot? The foliage looked good.
I'm sorry, what was the plant again? I was looking at
Oh,
the wrong question. Sorry.
Astilbe. I
Oh,
skipped
it's
down
still
because
be
we were
no.
talking about
Okay.
that. Yeah.
Okay. Um, yeah, I think moisture is key. If the leaves are looking good and it's not flowering, it could be sometimes it takes a year to get established, could be too much fertilizer. Um, it could be too much shade. I mean, they're pretty shade tolerant, but if you're not getting the blooms, maybe just moving it in a place that gets a bit more sunlight. But if the leaves look great, it's getting enough moisture, so you're taking good care of it. So yeah, if it's been in the ground a few years and you're not getting flowers, then yeah, I would definitely um, maybe consider moving it. Spring's a great time just as it's emerging.
Donna's got a question about hydrangeas. She's asking, you talked about deer really liking hydrangeas. I've got a limelight hydrangea that the deer have been eating every year. Last fall, I planted garlic under the shrub. Do you think this will keep the deer away?
So here's my thing about deer. Even if you're using a repellent, if you're trying to fence them out, always monitor. Um, it can't hurt. I haven't really seen good research backing it, but hey, you got garlic. Why not? I would still monitor. I did a video for plant skin on hydrangeas, and I have a lot of panicle hydrangeas, limelight's a panicle, and the deer would just eat the dried flowers. And I thought, oh, good, I don't have to deadhead. So when I was getting ready to do this video, I went out to my berry white and I'm like, there's a bush in front of my berry white. No, that was the front of my berry white. The deer took down the 3 feet. So the deer have found my hydrangeas. So I use plant skid on those. One guy told me he puts rebar in the garden and puts wine bottles upside down so they rattle. pretty blue ones, so it's kind of decorative. He said that helped scare them away. Again, it depends on the pressure, how many, and where else they can go feed. So I would keep an eye on it and be ready to do plan B. And that's true with any deer or rabbit control that you try or any animal control. Just you may have to adapt throughout the season. And let us know if you had good success. It could be just this year with the garlic, and maybe you're on to something. And hey, you'll have some garlic, so that's good.
I know we talked about transplanting plants in the spring. Libby is wondering when is the best time to transplant, and I'm going to mispronounce that name again, the
Hakanakloa.
Hakanakloa.
I
Yes.
know it's think Hawaii. That's a
Thanks.
so I would do it when it emerges in the spring. It blooms more into the summertime, late spring, early summer. Kind of the old adage is blooms in the spring, transplant late summer, fall, blooms in the fall, transplant in the spring, blooms in the summer, either time. Um, but again, depending on where you live, it likes moisture, and once you dig and divide it, you're going to have to give it that TLC, especially the first couple years. So kind of think about your weather conditions, your schedule and time frame. But I like to, if I can, dig and divide things or move things when they're just coming up. But sometimes our schedules don't allow. So as long as you can give it good post-transplant care, you're going to be fine. And moisture is critical to get this one established.
Lynn has a question about planting Virginia waterleaf.
Okay.
Would you recommend planting that? It seems rather invasive.
No, it's native and it is, and so according to the Wisconsin description of invasive plants, it's not invasive, but boy, it will take over. And so I'm with you, Lynn. It is very aggressive and it spreads. It has pretty flowers. The leaves have a little white mark on them. So you'll see it out in the woodland. I think as long as it has other enough shade to keep it contained, but it's one of those that I'd probably think twice about before I put it in, unless that's all I wanted in the garden or the woodland. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Thanks, everyone. And let's do just one more question here from Anne. Anne is wondering, how heavy should she go on pruning rhododendron? It's getting too big for the location. And also, when should that be pruned?
So rhododendrons have set their flower and azaleas have set their flower buds for this spring. So you're going to want to do it just like you do your lilacs and forsythia after they bloom so that you get maximum bloom. It won't hurt to do it before, but why have them if you don't manage them? One of the things, the heavier we prune, the more regrowth we get. And so usually the rule of thumb is like a third at the most, a fourth to a third. So when you look at the overall volume, so you may want to go, okay, my plant's 6 feet tall. I'm going to take it down 2 feet this year. Maybe stagger some of the prunes so you keep some of that natural form. Then if it's still too big, then next year reduce the size a little more. If you take it down too severely, I've seen plants grow bigger than they started with. So no more than a third, a fourth is even better. And then I would do it after they bloom if you want the flowers, because that way you get to enjoy the beautiful blooms.
Thank you, Melinda. And thanks
Thanks,
to
Kelly.
absolutely. Thanks to everyone that tuned in tonight. I was seeing some locations in the chat. I saw someone from Nova Scotia tuning
Wow.
in, all over the US. I know we've had someone from Minnesota I was seeing recently, all over Wisconsin. So thanks to everyone for tuning in this evening. Like I said, we are recording this, so we'll send out that recording, probably within a couple of days here, along with Melinda's handout. And then, yeah, like Melinda was saying, if you have any other questions, Melinda, where should they email those?
info@melindamyers.com. And then if there are other topics you want covered, I'm always, I do these for you guys as much as like to learn things and for my sponsors. So if you have topics you want covered, or if I can help you find a resource if I can't cover it, I'm happy to pass it along. So love to hear from you.
And again, don't forget to call Diggers Hotline if you're going to be
Oh,
digging in
thank
your
you.
yard. Oh, a personal testament. I've called them a couple of times over the years, and they're very responsive. I just do the online request form, so really easy to fill out, and
Yeah.
they, show up within a few days. So it's a great service. Um, yeah. Well, thank you
And
so
thank you.
much.
And thank you, Kelly. And thanks to all of you who joined and hung in there through the long webinar and Q&A section. I'm always happy to
Uh,
stay as long as you guys are too. So thank you.
Absolutely. So thanks everyone. Be on the lookout for that follow-up email, and we will have lots more webinars this spring and summer with Melinda. We have one tomorrow evening as well. So you can check out the registration link at mpl.org and also on Melinda's website. And I hope you'll join us next time. So thank you everyone. Have a good evening. Bye now.